We are now ready to start Act 2 of Macbeth. Act 2 picks up immediately or slightly later in the same evening that Act 1 ended. Duncan is staying the night at the Macbeth's castle, and they have come up with a solid plan for murdering him. When Act 2 starts, it is nighttime already, and Banquo is he's not really on night watch, but he's kind of wandering around at night. And we get to meet Banquo's son, Fleance. And Fleance is important because, as you might remember, Banquo is Macbeth's best friend. He was with him when they met the witches. And after the witches predicted that Macbeth would become king, Banquo asked them to tell his future. And the witches predicted that Banquo's sons would be kings. And so here we are meeting one of Banquo's sons. So this has a bit of significance to us if we think back through that. He's young. He's probably about 12 years old. He is not a grown person, and you can hear that in his voice when he starts talking. And so then they talk. Macbeth and Banquo have a bit of a conversation. Banquo wants to bring up the Weird sisters, the witches, and Macbeth kind of tries to set it aside. He doesn't really want to talk about that right now. And then after their conversation, Macbeth is left alone for his second long soliloquy. So we will look at that in just a minute. As we listen through this beginning of this scene, pay attention to Banquo's relationship with Fleance and pay attention to the way Macbeth is behaving, since he knows that he's got a heinous task to perform after everyone goes to sleep.
How goes the night, boy?
The moon is down. I've not heard the clock.
And she goes down at 12.
I take it is later, sir.
Hold. Take my sword. There's husbandry in heaven. Their candles are all out. Take thee that, too. A heavy summons lies like lead upon me, and yet I would not sleep. Merciful powers, restrain in me the cursed thoughts that nature gives way to in repose. Give me my sword. Who's there?
A friend.
What, sir? Not yet at rest. The king's abed. He hath been in unusual pleasure and sent forth great largesse to your offices. This diamond he greets your wife withal, by the name of most kind hostess, and shut up in measureless content.
Being unprepared, our will became the servant to defect, which else should free have wrought.
All's well. I dreamt last night of the three weird sisters. To you they have showed some truth.
I think not of them. Yet when we can entreat an outer, sir, we will spend it in some words upon that business, if you would grant the time.
At your kindest leisure.
If you shall cleave to my consent when 'tis, it shall make honor for you.
So I lose none in seeking to augment it, but still keep my bosom franchised and allegiance clear. I shall be counseled.
Good repose the while.
Thanks, sir. The like to you.
Go bid thy mistress, when my drink is ready, she strike upon the bell. Get thee to bed. My God.
All right, so there are a couple of important things in this conversation. First of all, I want to point out that Banquo's comment here, there's husbandry in heaven, their candles are all out. What he's saying here is that there are no stars out. And this should remind a careful reader of the fact that the Macbeths, it was specifically Macbeth himself, told the stars to hide their fires. and they have listened. So that is an interesting correlation. That, remember, the Macbeth's call upon the darkness, and here Banquo is pointing out the stars are hiding their fires. Here we also have Banquo kneeling and praying to the merciful powers. This sets up Banquo as being different than Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, in that he prays to the merciful powers of God instead of to the evil spirits that we see Lady Macbeth summoning. Banquo is a virtuous character, and it is important that we pay attention to him for that reason. Whereas the Macbeths are conflicted and they're trying to decide how to act, and we see other characters kind of having this moral dilemma, Banquo does not have a moral dilemma. Banquo is a virtuous person, and he stands by that. We see that again down here when Macbeth asks Banquo, he says, "If you shall cleave to my consent when 'tis, it shall make honor for you. If you shall adhere to my opinions when it's time, it shall make honor for you." And he's being very vague on purpose. He's just kind of saying, if you will stick with me when stuff happens, it will turn out well for you. So he just kind of says when 'tis, he's just saying when stuff happens. And so he's being intentionally vague. We know what he's talking about, but Banquo certainly does not. However, Banquo might suspect that Macbeth does not mean honorable things, because what he says here, he says, "so that I lose none," and none here goes back to honor. So because Macbeth says it'll make honor for you, Banquo says, "so that I lose none in seeking to augment it." So Macbeth used the word honor meaning rewards, meaning titles and power. But Banquo uses honor to mean honorable actions. And so he's saying, as long as it doesn't affect my honor and will keep my bosom franchised, you have the translation here, it will keep my conscience clear and my allegiance clear, then I will be counseled, then I will take your advice. Banquo basically says that he will only stick with Macbeth if he can do so honorably. And so since we know what Macbeth is talking about, we can kind of see here that this is not going to be something that Banquo wants to be a part of. And he basically just let Macbeth know that as well. So in this scene, he also reveals to Macbeth that he will not act dishonorably. So he's not willing to act dishonorably. And so now Macbeth knows the character of his friend. I skipped right past this because we were still talking about Macbeth's or Banquo's character. But when Banquo says, "I dreamt last night of the Weird Sisters," he's opening a door for Macbeth to talk about them like he said he wanted to. Macbeth dismisses it right away. "I think not of them," which we know is a lie. Macbeth is obsessed with thinking about the Weird Sisters and their predictions. But he says out loud to Banquo, "I think not of them." He is trying to throw Banquo off the scent. He's trying to state out loud that what they said is not important to him. It kind of gives him an alibi or an out for when stuff does go down. So then finally, Banquo adjourns with his son Fleance, and Macbeth sends his servant away. And now he has a long soliloquy. he begins, "Is this a dagger which I see before me?" And so this is a scene of hallucination. He is hallucinating a dagger floating right before him. And he talks about that dagger for a minute. What I want you to pay attention to as we read through this is, what does this show us about Macbeth's state of mind before he goes in to commit murder? And then later throughout the speech, you will again hear this is kind of where the speech begins to turn, and Macbeth now begins to talk about the darkness yet again. And he's very metaphorical and poetic. He's very poetic here about nighttime. And so you can just kind of enjoy the poetry of that moment.
Is this a dagger which I see before me? The handle toward my hand? Come, let me clutch thee. I have thee not, and yet I see thee still. Art thou not, fatal vision, sensible to feeling as to sight? Or art thou but a dagger of the mind, a false creation proceeding from the heat oppressed brain? I see thee yet, in form as palpable as this which now I draw. Thou marshalst me the way that I was going, and such an instrument I was to use. Mine eyes are made the fools of the other senses, or else worth all the rest. I see thee still, and on thy blade and dudgeon gouts of blood which was not so before. There's no such thing. It is the bloody business which informs thus to mine eyes. Now o'er the one half world nature seems dead, and wicked dreams abuse the curtained sleep. Witchcraft celebrates pale Hecate's offerings, and withered murder, alarmed by his sentinel, the wolf whose howls his watch, thus with his stealthy pace, with Tarquin's ravishing strides, towards his design moves like a ghost. Sure and firm set earth, hear not my steps, which way they walk, for fear thy very stones prate of my whereabout, and take the present horror from the time which now suits with it. Whiles I threat, he lives. Words to the heat of deeds too cold breath gives. I go, and it is done. The bell invites me. Hear it not, Duncan, for it is a knell that summons thee to heaven or to hell.
All right. So he is hallucinating this dagger in front of him. And at some point, the dagger even begins to drop blood from it. Little drops of blood begin to fall. And so he says a couple of important things here. He calls it a fatal vision, meaning that, of course, it is marshaling him the way he was going to go. It's kind of pointing toward Duncan's chamber. He recognizes at this point that it's just a dagger of the mind and that he is seeing things. He calls it out right here at the end. He says, "There's no such thing," meaning that at this point, Macbeth can tell his vision from reality. So he can tell hallucination from reality. So while it does say something about his mindset, what does it take to hallucinate something? He's seeing things. So it shows his mind is slipping, or that the murder is already affecting him before he's even done it. But also, he does know that it's not real. So he's not seeing things to the point where he thinks the dagger's actually there. That's worth noting. Then, toward the end of this, he begins to talk about nature. And one of our themes for this act is nature versus the unnatural. So, nature means the way things should be. Nature means things that occur naturally, things that occur because they should, things that occur by growing, things that properly is what I'll say, just the way they should. It has to do with animals and plants and weather. And it is the opposite of unnatural. Unnatural means things that go against nature, things that should not occur. And so we're going to notice a lot of those things. And I noticed it right here in this one because his first statement is nature seems dead. And so if nature are things like plants and animals that are alive and they seem dead, then right away there we have a shift. We have something that is the opposite of what it should be. Also, with this word seems is important because it means appearances. And we've already talked about the theme of appearances. All right, so then he goes into this deep example, or he's kind of talking poetically about nighttime. He talks about wicked dreams, the curtains sleep. He talks about witchcraft. And Hecate is the queen of the witches. We will meet her later in the play. And he starts talking about animals that howl and prowl at night. Tarquin is he's making these references to mythology, and then he moves on to call to the earth. He has called to the stars, and the stars went out for him, and darkness is going to hide things for him. Now he calls out to the earth and says, "Earth, hear not my steps, for fear that even the stones of the earth would tell my whereabouts." Because what he's about to do is something so unnatural that even the world of nature might tell on him, might point it out. And then finally, this bell rings, and he is kind of cast out of his reverie and called to go do the task he knows he has to do. And I like this couplet that ends the scene. "Hear it not, Duncan, for it is a knell that summons thee to heaven or to hell," pointing out he's going one place or the other, and he's going there tonight. We will see this echoed in another couplet later in the play. And so with that announcement, Macbeth wanders off stage to go commit murder.